like fear that the government is going to come to your home and ship you to Guantanamo and keep you there for a decade without charges. Or you probably don't wake up worried that that afternoon the government is going to send drones, unmanned drones over your house and launch a Hellfire missile that will explode your house and kill your family. Or that you will be persecuted for your political speech by being charged with criminal offenses. And so it's easy to keep these at a sort of distance and to think that, well, even though I'm intellectually sympathetic to them, I don't really feel like they're of immediate concern to me, and so it's easy to deprioritize them. So I want to talk about why all of those assumptions are untrue and ways that I think that those assumptions can be dislodged when talking to other people about why they should care more about them or think that these things are disturbing. So the first point I want to talk about is the nature of what we even mean when we talk about these basic liberties. What does it mean that we refer to when we describe civil liberties or the assault on civil liberties or constitutional freedoms or the basic rights that in the Western tradition have come to define freedom? And really all that means, it's a pretty simple concept, all it really means is the limits and the lines that we've imposed on the government that they cannot cross under any circumstances, because we believe that to allow them to cross those lines is too dangerous and will inevitably lead to some form of tyranny. So, for example, generally in Western societies that consider themselves free, we have the idea that governments can't imprison us unless they first charge us with a crime and present the evidence in a fair and open tribunal and convince either a jury or a judge beyond reasonable doubt or some standard that we're actually guilty of those crimes. We certainly believe that governments can't simply target us for assassination. We think that powers that the government exercises that are the most consequential should not be exercised in complete secrecy in the dark, but instead should have all kinds of oversight and transparency to them. These are the kinds of things that we're talking about, the most basic safeguards to political freedom when we talk about civil liberties. And one of the ways that it's easy to convince the population to either accept and support assaults on those freedoms or to at least passively accept that they're going to happen is to convince people that they will not be affected, that only some minority group that probably deserves it in some way will be. That's what I was describing earlier by the way in which Western countries have been convinced that since most of these abuses are being applied to Muslims, and maybe even to Muslims who are sort of more religious, who seem a little bit more inclined to identify as Muslims rather than as Canadians or Americans or Brits, that specifically for those kinds of Muslims, that these are the groups of people to whom these abuses are being confined, and therefore I don't really need to care about them much. So leave aside the question of whether or not that is an incredibly immoral way of thinking, that as long as it's just them over there who are being tortured and detained and assassinated, I don't really need to worry about it as much as long as it doesn't happen to me. If somebody is of that mindset, there's probably not a lot that you can do to persuade them. But leave that aside, that question, and instead focus on the following, which is that it is simply an invariable truth in the history of politics and the history of government that whenever a new power is acquired in the name of some threat, it always, not sometimes, not often, not usually, it always extends beyond its original application, beyond its original justification. You know, it's amazing that in the United States in the wake of 9/11, one of the most controversial things that was done by the US government, and this was done in the weeks after 9/11, literally 2 weeks after 9/11, was the enactment of legislation called the Patriot Act that empowered the US government with all sorts of new powers of surveillance and infiltration. And at the time it was incredibly controversial. It was considered this radical step, but the country accepted it on the grounds that as the World Trade Center was still smoldering, it was necessary to take these extraordinary steps to prevent it from happening again. Well, 10 years later, the Patriot Act is not even controversial any longer. Every 4 years it has to get renewed, and the vote in the Congress and the Senate is something like 91-9 to renew it. Now that there's a Democrat in office, all Democrats and Republicans, with very few exceptions last year, voted to renew the Patriot Act with no reforms, no changes of any kind. It's become completely normalized. And the reason it's become completely normalized, whereas even in the wake of 9/11, the weeks after 9/11 it was considered radical, is because people have become convinced that the Patriot Act is something that only gets applied to Muslim radicals. That's the only people on whom the government is interested in spying. And the reality is completely the opposite. There are countless applications now of how the government uses the powers of the Patriot Act to spy on dissident political groups, on peace groups, to infiltrate student organizations who are opposing policies of the 9/11 attacks. The surveillance policies of the United States have grown dramatically so that there's almost no limits now on the way in which they can use these surveillance powers. I know, again, in my preparation for coming to Canada, there was a controversy. Some documents were obtained just in this week, I believe, where this federalized, national, centralized terrorist agency that is designed and was created to monitor threats of terrorism on Canadian soil basically got caught monitoring and infiltrating the Occupy movement that existed on Canadian soil on the grounds that they've now expanded their mandate so that any threats to Canadian national security, whether from Islamic terrorists wanting to blow up shopping centers, to college students gathering together and peacefully assembling in a park in order to protest financial policies, is now within the purview of this agency, and its powers can be used every bit as much against them as they can against Muslims. I know there's controversies in the defense ministry here where powers of spying and surveillance have been used against political opponents of the defense ministry. This is always the way in which power is expanded.